The bullet grazed so close to Wilhelmina Jordan's ear that she felt the heat of it before she heard the crack of the rifle, and in that instant she knew her father's enemies had finally come for what remained of their family. She threw herself behind the water trough outside the general store, her heart hammering against her ribs as splinters exploded from the wooden post where her head had been moments before. Trinidad, Colorado had been quiet when she'd arrived that morning in October of 1876, the kind of peaceful mountain town where a woman might forget that violence followed the Jordan name like a shadow. Her father had been dead 3 months now, shot down in the street by men who claimed he'd cheated them in a mining deal, and Wilhelmina had thought the matter settled with his blood. She'd been wrong. "Miss Jordan!" The shopkeeper's voice came from inside, high with panic. "Get in here!" But another shot shattered the store window, raining glass across the boardwalk, and Wilhelmina knew she'd be dead before she made it to the door. She was pinned, exposed, and the autumn sun beat down on her black mourning dress like a weight pressing her into the earth. 22 years old and about to die in the same town that had killed her father, and the injustice of it burned hotter than fear. Then she heard it. Not gunfire, but hoofbeats, coming fast from the north end of town. The rifle cracked again, and this time the trough beside her head exploded in a spray of water that soaked her dress and hair. Through the cascade, she saw him, a massive figure on a paint horse, riding straight into the gunfire with no more concern than if he were riding through summer rain. He was the biggest man she'd ever seen, broad-shouldered and thick-armed, with dark hair that fell past his collar and a beard that couldn't hide the hard line of his jaw. He wore buckskin and leather, and even at a distance she could see the corded muscle in his forearms as he controlled his horse with his knees alone, leaving both hands free. One of those hands held a rifle, and he fired it without seeming to aim, a casual motion that nevertheless sent one of her attackers stumbling backward from the roof of the saloon across the street. The other shooter, positioned behind a wagon, fired at the stranger and missed. The big man didn't miss. His second shot took the gunman in the shoulder and spun him around, sending his weapon clattering to the dirt. Then the stranger was beside her, swinging down from his horse in one fluid motion despite his size, and Wilhelmina found herself staring up at a face that looked like it had been carved from the mountains themselves. Hard plains and sharp angles, skin weathered by sun and wind, and eyes the color of storm clouds that assessed her in a single sweeping glance. "You hit?" His voice was deep, rougher than the bark on a pine tree. "No." She was surprised her own voice worked. "I'm not hurt." He nodded once, then moved to the corner of the trough and fired another shot at the wounded man who was trying to crawl toward his fallen rifle. The bullet kicked up dirt 6 inches from the man's hand, and he went still. "Stay down," the stranger said, and walked into the middle of the street like he owned it. Wilhelmina should have stayed down. Instead, she raised her head enough to watch as he approached the wounded shooter, his rifle trained on the man's chest. She couldn't hear what he said, but she saw the shooter shake his head violently, then gesture toward the saloon. The stranger looked up at the roof, at the body sprawled there, then back at the man on the ground. Another exchange of words, quieter this time, and then the stranger hauled the wounded man to his feet with one hand and shoved him toward the doctor's office. Only then did the townspeople begin emerging from their hiding places, murmuring and pointing. The sheriff, a soft-bellied man named Dawes, who hadn't lifted a finger when Wilhelmina's father was murdered, came rushing from his office with his pistol drawn, but no target left to point it at. The stranger ignored them all and walked back to where Wilhelmina still crouched behind the trough, water streaming from her dress and pooling around her knees. He stopped a respectful distance away and held out one large hand. "Name's Everett Thomas," he said, "and you'd best come with me before whoever hired those men sends more." Wilhelmina stared at his hand. It was broad and scarred, with calluses that spoke of hard work and harder living. No man had ever offered to help her like this, without asking for something in return. No man had ever looked at her with eyes that held concern instead of calculation. "I don't even know you," she said, but she took his hand anyway. His grip was solid, warm despite the cold water dripping from her fingers, and when he pulled her to her feet it was with such careful strength that she barely felt her own weight. He was even bigger standing close, broad enough to block out the sun, and the scent of leather and pine smoke clung to his buckskin shirt. "Don't need to know me," Everett Thomas said. "Just need to trust me long enough to get out of town, unless you'd rather wait and see if the next shooter has better aim." The sheriff was approaching now, his face red with exertion or embarrassment. Now hold on there, stranger. I'm the law in this town, and I'll decide what happens here. Everett Thomas turned his head slowly to look at the sheriff, and something in that movement made Dawes stop in his tracks. The law, Everett said in a tone that suggested he'd found something distasteful under his boot. Just watched two men try to murder a woman in broad daylight. Seems to me the law in this town is worth about as much as spit in a drought. Those men were claiming she owes them money, Dawes blustered. Her father made deals that went bad, and now they're looking for compensation. They can look for it through legal channels, not through a rifle sight. Everett's hand moved to Wilhelmina's elbow, steadying her as she swayed. Miss Jordan is coming with me. You have a problem with that, Sheriff. You're welcome to state it clear. Dawes's hand drifted toward his pistol, then away. Whatever he saw in Everett Thomas's eyes convinced him that discretion was the wiser choice. Where are you taking her? Somewhere safe. Everett turned to his paint horse, which had stood ground-tied through the entire gunfight, and gathered the reins. She can come back when you've done your job and arrested the men responsible for this. I don't even have any belongings, Wilhelmina said faintly. The shock was setting in now, making her limbs feel distant and strange. Everything I own is in the boarding house. I'll send someone for them, the shopkeeper called from his broken window. You go on, Miss Jordan. This man's right. Trinidad isn't safe for you. It should have frightened her, leaving with a complete stranger, riding off into the mountains with a man she'd known for all of 5 minutes. But as Everett Thomas lifted her onto his horse, with the same ease he might lift a child, settling her in front of the saddle, Wilhelmina felt something she hadn't felt since her father died. She felt safe. He swung up behind her, his arms coming around to take the reins, and for the first time in her life, Wilhelmina understood what it meant to be truly enclosed in a man's embrace. His chest was solid against her back, broad enough that she couldn't see past his shoulders. His arms, thick with muscle beneath the buckskin, caged her in without trapping her, and when the horse started forward, his body moved with an easy grace that kept her balanced in the saddle. No man had ever wrapped his arms around her like this. Her father had been distant, always focused on his next deal, his next scheme. The few suitors who'd come calling had been interested in her father's money, not in her, and they'd kept their distance when they realized she had no intention of being bought like one of his mining claims. But this man, this stranger, held her like she was something precious, something worth protecting, and Wilhelmina felt her throat tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. They rode north out of Trinidad, following a trail that led up into the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The October afternoon was warm in the valley, but as they climbed, the air grew cooler, sharp with the scent of pine and aspen. Everett Thomas said nothing, just kept the horse moving at a steady pace that ate up the miles without tiring the animal. After an hour, Wilhelmina finally found her voice. Where are you taking me? My cabin. It's another 2 hours up, hidden in a box canyon where nobody goes unless they know the way. His voice rumbled through his chest and into her back. You'll be safe there while we figure out who wants you dead and why. I already know who and why, Wilhelmina said bitterly. My father cheated half the territory in various mining schemes. He'd sell shares in claims that didn't exist, or claims that were already played out. When he got shot, the sheriff said it was bound to happen sooner or later. And you? I had nothing to do with his business. I tried to get him to stop, to live, honestly, but he said I didn't understand how the world worked. She felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back angrily. Now he's dead, and apparently I'm expected to pay his debts with my life. Everett Thomas was silent for a long moment. Then, your father's debts died with him. Any man who says different is a coward looking for an excuse. The simple certainty in his voice made something loosen in Wilhelmina's chest. The sheriff doesn't see it that way. The sheriff is a fool who's probably getting paid to look the other way. Everett guided the horse around a switchback, leaning back slightly to keep them balanced on the steep trail. I've seen his kind before, more interested in keeping the peace than keeping the law. And what are you interested in? Wilhelmina asked. Why did you help me? She felt him shrug, the motion shifting her slightly against his chest. Saw a woman in trouble. Didn't seem right to ride past. Most men would have. I'm not most men. That was becoming abundantly clear. Wilhelmina settled back against him, allowing herself to relax for the first time since the shooting started. His heartbeat was steady beneath her ear, slow and strong, and the rhythm of it began to ease the tension from her shoulders. The trail grew steeper and narrower, winding through stands of aspen that had turned gold with autumn. Above them, the peaks rose sharp against a sky so blue it hurt to look at, and somewhere in the distance, an elk bugled its challenge to the coming winter. Wilhelmina had lived in Colorado for 2 years since her father dragged her west from St. Louis, but she'd never been this far into the mountains. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache, wild and clean, and far removed from the ugliness of Trinidad. "Tell me about yourself," she said, surprising herself with the request. "Not much to tell." But after a moment he continued. "Grew up in these mountains. Been trapping and hunting since I was old enough to set a snare. Built my cabin 5 years ago when I got tired of wintering in town." "You don't like towns? Don't like crowds? Don't like noise? Don't like people who think talking is more important than listening?" He paused. "Present company accepted." Wilhelmina smiled despite everything. "I haven't said that much. You say what matters. That's rare." She thought about that as they climbed higher. Her father had talked constantly, spinning elaborate stories about his prospects and plans, and every word had been carefully chosen to manipulate his listeners. The people she'd met in Trinidad were little better, gossiping and scheming and saying one thing while meaning another. But Everett Thomas spoke like a man who'd spent so much time alone that he'd forgotten how to waste words. Everything he said was truth, plain and unadorned, and Wilhelmina found it more comforting than any pretty speech. The sun was low in the west when they finally reached the canyon. The entrance was a narrow gap between 2 towering rock faces, barely wide enough for a horse to pass through, and Wilhelmina would have ridden right past it if Everett hadn't guided them between the walls. Inside, the canyon opened into a hidden valley perhaps 200 yards across, with a stream running down the center and a meadow of brown grass where a small log cabin sat, tucked against the far wall. It was the most isolated place Wilhelmina had ever seen, and also the most peaceful. Everett dismounted first, then reached up to lift her down. His hands spanned her waist easily, and when he set her on her feet he held on for a moment longer, making sure she was steady. Wilhelmina looked up at him, at the hard planes of his face softened slightly by the golden light of sunset, and felt something shift in her chest. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for saving my life." His storm-gray eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw something other than calm assessment in them, something warmer, more personal. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," he said. "I'll ride back down tomorrow and find out what's really going on in Trinidad." "You don't have to do that." "I know." He released her waist and turned to tend to his horse. "But I'm going to anyway." Wilhelmina watched him work, removing the saddle and bridle with practiced efficiency, running his hands over the horse's legs to check for injuries. His movements were economical and sure, and she found herself noticing things she shouldn't be noticing. The way his buckskin shirt pulled tight across his shoulders when he reached up to hang the bridle on a peg. The flex of muscle in his forearms as he lifted the saddle. The casual strength in every motion that spoke of a body honed by hard mountain living. She looked away, her cheeks warming. She'd just nearly been killed, was stranded in the wilderness with a man she'd known for mere hours, and here she was admiring the breadth of his shoulders like some foolish girl. But when he finished with the horse and turned back to her, Wilhelmina felt it again. That strange, unfamiliar sensation of safety, of being seen and valued by someone who asked nothing in return. "Come inside," Everett said. "I'll get a fire going and find you something dry to wear. That dress must be uncomfortable." Wilhelmina looked down at herself and almost laughed. Her mourning dress was still soaked from the shattered water trough, plastered to her skin and dripping onto the ground. She must look like a drowned cat, bedraggled and pathetic. But when she glanced at Everett Thomas, she saw no judgment in his eyes, only concern, and something else she couldn't quite name. The cabin was a single large room with a stone fireplace at one end and a bed built into the far corner. Everything was neat and well-maintained, from the plank table by the window to the shelves lined with supplies. Furs hung on the walls for insulation, and the few pieces of furniture looked handmade but solid. It was a bachelor's home, built for function rather than comfort, but it was cleaner and more organized than Wilhelmina had expected. Everett knelt by the fireplace and began building a fire with the same efficient movements he'd used on his horse. Within minutes, flames were crackling cheerfully, pushing back the evening chill. He stood and went to a trunk by the bed, pulling out a shirt that looked like it would swallow her whole. "It's clean," he said, handing it to her, "and there's a blanket you can wrap around yourself for a skirt. I'll step outside while you change." He was gone before she could respond, the door closing softly behind him, and Wilhelmina was left alone in the growing firelight. She stripped off her wet dress with shaking hands, suddenly aware of how close she'd come to dying today. If Everett Thomas hadn't arrived when he did, if those men had aimed just a little better, she'd be bleeding out in the street right now while Trinidad went about its business. The thought made her sink onto the edge of the bed. Her damp dress pooled at her feet, and for the first time since the shooting started, she allowed herself to cry. She cried for her father, for all his flaws and schemes and the twisted love he'd shown her. She cried for the lonely years in Trinidad, watching her father destroy himself with greed while she stood helpless. She cried for the terror of those moments behind the water trough, certain she was about to die. And she cried because a stranger had saved her, had ridden into gunfire without hesitation, had brought her to safety and asked nothing in return, and she didn't know how to accept such kindness. When the tears finally stopped, Wilhelmina dried her face and pulled on Everett's shirt. It hung to her knees, the sleeves extending well past her fingertips, and it smelled of pine smoke and leather and something else that was uniquely him. She found the blanket he'd mentioned and wrapped it around her waist, securing it as best she could, then opened the door. Everett was sitting on a stump near the creek, whittling a piece of wood with a knife that looked sharp enough to shave with. He glanced up when she emerged, and something in his expression softened. "Better?" "Yes, thank you." Wilhelmina walked over to him, the blanket trailing in the grass. "I'm sorry for imposing on you like this." "You're not imposing." He returned his attention to his whittling. "I don't get much company up here, but that doesn't mean I don't appreciate it when it comes." She sat down on a nearby rock, tucking the blanket around her legs. The evening air was cool but not cold, and the fire inside had taken the chill from her bones. Above them, the first stars were appearing, brighter than she'd ever seen them in town. "What are you making?" she asked. Everett held up the wood, which was beginning to take the shape of a small bird. "Habit, mostly. Keeps my hands busy." "It's beautiful." He shrugged, but she saw a hint of pleasure in his eyes. "Just something to do." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Everett whittling and Wilhelmina watching the stars emerge. The stream burbled over its rocky bed, and somewhere in the distance a coyote sang to the rising moon. It should have been frightening, being so far from civilization with a man she barely knew. But instead, Wilhelmina felt a peace she'd never experienced before, as if she'd stumbled into a place outside of time where the ugliness of the world couldn't reach her. "Why do you live alone up here?" she finally asked. Everett was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Came back from the war in '65. Found I couldn't stand being around people anymore. Too much noise, too many lies, too much pretending that things were normal when nothing would ever be normal again. The war changed a lot of men. Changed everyone." He made a careful cut along the bird's wing. "But some of us couldn't go back to pretending it didn't happen. So I came up here where I didn't have to." Wilhelmina heard the pain beneath his words, old but not forgotten. "Do you ever get lonely?" "Sometimes." He glanced at her, those storm-gray eyes catching the last light. "But lonely is better than feeling alone in a crowd." She understood that better than she wanted to admit. She'd felt alone her entire life, even when her father was alive, even in the midst of Trinidad's bustling streets. Alone because no one really saw her, no one cared who she was beneath the surface. But Everett Thomas saw her. She could feel it in the way he looked at her, direct and honest, with no hidden agenda behind his gaze. He saw her and asked nothing except that she be herself. It was terrifying and wonderful all at once. "I should make us something to eat," Everett said, standing and folding his knife. "You must be hungry." Wilhelmina realized she was famished. She'd skipped breakfast that morning, too nervous about going into town, and lunch had been interrupted by men trying to kill her. Her stomach growled in response, and Everett's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. Inside the cabin, he assembled a simple meal of salt pork, beans, and cornbread that he baked in a Dutch oven at the edge of the fire. It was plain food, nothing like the meals Wilhelmina had grown up with in St. Louis, but it tasted better than anything she'd eaten in months. They ate at the plank table, the firelight dancing across the log walls, and Wilhelmina found herself watching Everett more than she should. He moved with such economy of motion, every gesture purposeful and controlled. There was no wasted energy, no unnecessary flourish. And yet there was grace in it too, the kind of grace that came from a body perfectly attuned to its environment. She wondered what it would be like to possess that kind of confidence, that deep certainty in one's own capabilities. "Tell me about St. Louis," Everett said, surprising her out of her thoughts. "What do you want to know?" "What it was like growing up there. What brought you west?" So Wilhelmina told him. About her mother dying when she was 12, leaving her alone with a father who saw her more as an inconvenience than a daughter. About the elegant house on Delmar Boulevard that had slowly emptied as her father sold their possessions to fund his schemes. About the creditors who'd finally forced them to flee, sneaking out in the middle of the night like thieves, leaving everything behind. "He promised it would be better out west," she said quietly. "Said there were opportunities here that we could start fresh. And for a while I believed him. But he just found new people to cheat, new ways to dig himself deeper into debt. You tried to stop him." It wasn't a question, but Wilhelmina nodded anyway. "I begged him to find honest work, told him we could live simply, that I could take in sewing or work at the hotel. But he said he wasn't going to have his daughter working like a common servant." She laughed bitterly. "He'd rather die than let me work honestly, and in the end that's exactly what happened." Everett reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The touch was warm, solid, anchoring. "His choices aren't your burden to carry. But I am carrying them. Those men today, they want me to pay for what he did. Those men are cowards using your father as an excuse. Don't give them power by believing their lies." Wilhelmina looked at their joined hands, at the way his fingers dwarfed hers, calloused and scarred from hard living. She should pull away. She barely knew this man. But instead, she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." His hand tightened around hers, gentle but firm. "You don't need to keep thanking me." "I do, though, because men like you don't exist in my world. Men who help without wanting something in return, who protect without demanding payment." She met his eyes across the table. "You saved my life today and you don't even know me." "I know enough." His thumb moved across her knuckles, a slow stroke that sent warmth racing up her arm. "I know you tried to save your father from himself. I know you stood in that street facing down men with rifles and didn't beg or cry. I know you're stronger than you think you are." I was terrified. Brave isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite it. The words settled into Wilhelmina's chest like seeds taking root. She'd never thought of herself as brave. She'd always been the dutiful daughter, the quiet girl who did as she was told and never made waves. But maybe Everett was right. Maybe there was strength in simply surviving, in continuing to stand when everything tried to knock you down. They finished their meal in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, full of things that didn't need to be said. When the plates were clean, Everett carried them to a bucket of water by the door and began washing them with the same methodical care he brought to everything. "You should take the bed," he said without turning around. "I'll sleep on the floor." "I can't take your bed." "You can, and you will. I've slept on worse than a floor with furs on it." He glanced over his shoulder at her. "Besides, you've been through enough today. Let yourself rest properly." Wilhelmina wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pulling at her limbs like a heavy weight. The adrenaline that had kept her going was fading, leaving her hollowed out and shaky. "Where will you sleep?" "Right here by the fire. I'll be close if you need anything." The thought of him sleeping nearby, close enough to hear if she called out, should have made her nervous. Instead, it made her feel safe in a way she'd never experienced before. Protected, cared for. She stood and moved to the bed, pulling back the thick furs that served as blankets. The mattress was stuffed with something soft, probably dried grass or pine needles, and when she lay down it conformed to her body with surprising comfort. Everett finished with the dishes and began laying out his own bedding on the floor, moving quietly in deference to her presence. "Everett?" she spoke before she could stop herself. He looked up, his face half in shadow. "Yes? Will you really go back to Trinidad tomorrow?" If you want me to, if you want to know who's behind this. I'm afraid of what you might find. I'm afraid that you'll get hurt because of me." He crossed the room and knelt beside the bed, bringing his eyes level with hers. In the firelight, his face was all hard angles and shadows, beautiful in its rough masculinity. "I've been taking care of myself in these mountains for a long time, Wilhelmina. A few town toughs don't scare me." It was the first time he'd said her name, and the sound of it in his deep voice made something flutter in her chest. "I don't want you to get hurt," she repeated softly. "I won't." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch feather light. "Get some sleep. Everything will look clearer in the morning." He stood and returned to his bedroll, settling down with his back to her, giving her privacy. Wilhelmina watched the broad expanse of his shoulders rise and fall with his breathing. And for the first time since her father died, she felt like she wasn't completely alone in the world. She closed her eyes and listened to the crackle of the fire, the distant sound of the stream, and the quiet presence of the man who'd saved her life. And despite everything that had happened, despite the fear and uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring, Wilhelmina Jordan fell asleep, feeling safe. She woke in darkness to the sound of her own screaming. The nightmare had been vivid and terrible. Gunfire and blood, her father's body in the street, the cold eyes of the men who'd tried to kill her. She'd been running through Trinidad streets with bullets chasing her, and every door she tried was locked, every window shuttered, until finally there was nowhere left to go and the rifles were pointing at her chest and, "Wilhelmina, Wilhelmina, you're safe, you're here with me." Strong arms wrapped around her, pulling her against a solid chest, and Wilhelmina realized she was sitting up in bed with Everett Thomas holding her. She was shaking violently, her breath coming in gasps, and she could feel tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you." "Hush, you have nothing to apologize for." His arms tightened around her, one hand coming up to cradle the back of her head. "You're safe. I'm here. Nothing can hurt you." Wilhelmina buried her face against his chest and let herself cry, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the fear she'd suppressed all day, for the trauma of watching her father die, for the loneliness of the past 3 months. And through it all, Everett held her, solid and unmoving, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. No man had ever held her like this. No man had ever offered comfort without expectation, without trying to take advantage of her vulnerability. But Everett Thomas simply held her, his arms a sanctuary against the darkness, and gradually Wilhelmina's sobs subsided into quiet tears. "Tell me about the nightmare," he said softly. "It was the shooting, but mixed up with my father's death. I kept trying to find somewhere safe, but every door was locked." She took a shuddering breath. "I know it was just a dream, but it felt so real. Dreams after something like that always do." His hand moved slowly through her hair, a soothing rhythm. "I still have nightmares about the war sometimes. Wake up thinking I'm back in the wilderness or at Cold Harbor, and it takes a while to remember where I am. How do you deal with it? Remember that it's over, that I survived, that the past can't hurt me anymore unless I let it." He shifted slightly, settling more comfortably against the side of the bed. "And I remind myself that every sunrise is a gift I didn't expect to receive." Wilhelmina tilted her head back to look at him. In the dim glow of the banked fire, his face was all shadows and strong lines, his eyes dark and serious. "You expected to die in the war?" "Most days, yes. Saw enough men fall to know it could be me next." His hand stilled in her hair. "But I'm still here. And so are you, despite men trying to make it otherwise. That means something." "What does it mean?" "That we have more living to do, more moments to experience, more reasons to wake up and see the sunrise." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, wiping away a tear. "Don't let them steal that from you, Wilhelmina. Don't let fear turn you into a ghost." The intimacy of the moment wrapped around them like the furs on the bed. Everett was still holding her, her body pressed against his, and Wilhelmina could feel the heat of him through the thin shirt she wore. She should pull away. This was improper, scandalous even, to be in a man's arms in the middle of the night. But she didn't want to pull away. For the first time in her life, she wanted to stay exactly where she was, enclosed in the safety of his embrace, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "Will you stay?" she whispered. Just until I fall asleep again? I'll stay as long as you need me to." He shifted position, moving to sit with his back against the log wall, and gently arranged her so she was curled against his side. His arm remained around her shoulders, holding her close, and Wilhelmina rested her head on his chest. She could hear his heartbeat again, that slow, steady rhythm that seemed to anchor her to the present moment. "Tell me something," she said quietly. "Something good. Something that has nothing to do with violence or death." Everett was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then, "In the spring, this valley fills with wildflowers. Columbine and lupine and Indian paintbrush, so thick you can barely see the grass. The elk come down from the high country with their calves, and the creek runs so full of snowmelt, it sounds like thunder. Everything is green and alive and growing. It sounds beautiful. It is. First time I saw it, I knew this was where I wanted to build my cabin, knew this was home. Do you ever wish you had someone to share it with?" She felt his chest rise and fall with a deep breath. "Sometimes. But I never met anyone who I thought would understand this life, who would see the beauty in the isolation instead of just the loneliness." "I think I could understand it," Wilhelmina said softly. "I think I could see the beauty." His arm tightened around her. "I think you could too." They fell silent again, but Wilhelmina's mind was racing. She'd known this man for less than a day, and yet she felt more connected to him than to anyone she'd ever met. There was something between them, something that had sparked to life the moment he wrapped his arms around her on that horse, and it was growing stronger with every passing hour. It was dangerous to feel this way. She was vulnerable, traumatized, dependent on his protection. These feelings might just be gratitude or the relief of finding safety after terror. She needed to be careful, to guard her heart against false emotions born of circumstance. But when Everett's hand moved slowly up and down her arm, a gentle, repetitive motion meant to soothe, Wilhelmina knew this was more than gratitude. This was recognition, soul calling to soul, finding in another person something that had always been missing. "Everett," she said again. "Thank you for holding me." His hand stilled on her arm. "You don't need to thank me for that either." "But no man has ever—" She trailed off, not sure how to explain. "My father wasn't affectionate, and I've never had suitors who wanted more than my father's money. So no one has ever just held me like this, like I matter." "You do matter." His voice was rough with emotion. "Don't ever think you don't." Wilhelmina closed her eyes and let herself sink into the warmth of his embrace. Her exhaustion was returning, but this time it felt peaceful rather than overwhelming. Safe in Everett's arms, with his heartbeat steady beneath her ear and his hand gentle on her arm, she let herself drift back toward sleep. The last thing she was aware of was Everett shifting slightly, settling more comfortably, his arms never loosening their hold. He was going to stay with her, she realized, going to hold her through the night, keeping the nightmares at bay with his presence. No man had ever done that for her before. And as Wilhelmina slipped back into sleep, she found herself hoping that Everett Thomas would be the man who would hold her for many nights to come. She woke to golden morning light streaming through the cabin's single window and the smell of coffee brewing on the fire. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was, but then memory flooded back. The shooting, the ride into the mountains, the nightmare, and Everett's arms around her. She sat up quickly, looking around the cabin. Everett was at the fireplace, his back to her, tending to something in a pan. He'd clearly been up for a while, long enough to rebuild the fire and start breakfast, and Wilhelmina felt a pang of guilt that he'd spent half the night holding her when he should have been sleeping. "Morning," he said without turning around, somehow sensing she was awake. "Coffee's ready if you want some." "Thank you." Wilhelmina stood, wrapping the blanket around herself like a skirt again, and crossed to the table where he'd set out 2 tin cups. She poured herself coffee from the pot and took a careful sip. It was strong and bitter, nothing like the refined blends she'd grown up with, but it warmed her from the inside out. Everett brought over 2 plates of eggs and more cornbread, setting them on the table before taking his own seat. In the morning light, he looked tired, with shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there yesterday, and Wilhelmina felt another stab of guilt. "You didn't sleep much, did you?" she said. He shrugged. "I've gone with less, don't worry about it." "But you stayed with me all night." You needed me to. He met her eyes across the table, his expression serious. And I wanted to. There's a difference. Wilhelmina felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked down at her plate. The eggs were cooked perfectly, the cornbread still warm from the fire, and she forced herself to take a bite, even though her stomach was fluttering with emotions she couldn't name. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Everett spoke again. I'm riding down to Trinidad this morning. Want to talk to a few people, see if I can find out who's behind the attempt on your life. It's too dangerous. I'll be careful, and I won't be gone long, a few hours at most. He finished his eggs and pushed his plate away. You'll be safe here. The canyon entrance is hidden, and I'll leave you my spare rifle. Anyone tries to come up here, you shoot first and ask questions later. I don't know how to shoot a rifle. Everett stood and went to the corner where several weapons leaned against the wall. He selected a lever-action Winchester and brought it to the table. It's not hard. I'll show you before I leave. After breakfast, he took her outside and spent an hour teaching her the basics: how to load the rifle, how to aim, how to work the lever to chamber a new round. They practiced on a dead tree across the meadow, and Wilhelmina was surprised to find she had a decent eye for it. By the time Everett was satisfied she could hit what she aimed at, the sun was well above the canyon walls. Remember, he said as he saddled his paint horse, anyone comes into this canyon who isn't me, you shoot them. Don't hesitate, don't ask who they are, just shoot. I understand. Wilhelmina hugged the rifle to her chest, trying not to show how nervous she was about being left alone. Everett swung into the saddle and looked down at her, his storm-gray eyes serious. I'll be back before dark. Keep the fire going and stay inside. Can you do that? Yes. He nodded once, then surprised her by leaning down from the saddle. His hand cupped her cheek, gentle despite the calluses, and for a moment Wilhelmina thought he might kiss her. But instead, he just looked at her, drinking in her face like he was memorizing it. Stay safe, Wilhelmina Jordan. Then he was riding away, disappearing through the narrow gap in the canyon walls, and Wilhelmina was alone. The day passed slowly. She kept busy cleaning the cabin, which didn't really need cleaning but gave her something to do with her hands. She found her dress from yesterday hanging by the fire, dry now but stiff with creek water, and she changed back into it despite its discomfort. Wearing Everett's shirt had felt too intimate, too much like claiming a relationship they didn't have. But even in her own clothes, surrounded by his things, she felt his presence. The cabin smelled like him, pine smoke and leather and something clean and masculine. His furs were on the bed where she'd slept, his dishes were on the shelf, his life was in every carefully crafted detail. And she found herself wanting to be part of that life. It was madness. She'd known him for a single day. But Wilhelmina couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been waiting her whole life to meet someone like Everett Thomas. Someone who saw her for who she was instead of what she represented. Someone who offered protection without demanding submission in return. Someone who held her through the night and asked nothing but that she feel safe. The afternoon wore on and Wilhelmina's nervousness grew. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow seemed threatening. She kept the rifle close, checking and rechecking that it was loaded, and found herself counting the hours until Everett's promised return. The sun was touching the western canyon rim when she finally heard hoofbeats. Wilhelmina grabbed the rifle and positioned herself by the window, her heart hammering as she watched the canyon entrance. Everett emerged through the gap, alone on his paint horse, and the relief that flooded through her was so intense it made her knees weak. She set the rifle aside and rushed to the door, pulling it open as he dismounted. "Did you find anything?" she called out. His expression was grim. "Let me tend to my horse first, then we'll talk." That wasn't promising. Wilhelmina waited impatiently while Everett unsaddled and rubbed down the paint, her anxiety building with every passing minute. Finally he finished and walked over to her, his face serious. "Tell me," she said, "inside." They went into the cabin and Everett poured himself coffee from the pot she'd kept warm, draining half the cup before he spoke. "The men who shot at you were hired by a businessman named Carson Webb. He claims your father sold him shares in a silver mine that turned out to be worthless, cost him nearly $20,000. Wilhelmina sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. Carson Webb. She remembered him, a florid-faced man with cold eyes who'd come to their boarding house several times in the months before her father died. "I remember him. He threatened my father, said he'd make him pay. Well, now he's decided to make you pay instead." Everett set his cup down with enough force to make it rattle. He's put out word that anyone who brings him proof of your death gets $500. $500. In Trinidad, that was enough money to tempt desperate men to murder. What am I going to do? You're going to stay here while I deal with Carson Webb. Deal with him how? Everett's expression went hard. However I need to. No. Wilhelmina stood, moving between him and the door. You can't just kill him. That makes you a murderer. He put a price on your head. And killing him won't remove it. Someone else will just pick up where he left off, and you'll have blood on your hands for nothing. She grabbed his arm, feeling the muscle tense beneath her fingers. There has to be another way. What way? The sheriff won't help. The law in Trinidad is bought and paid for. Everett looked down at her hand on his arm, and some of the hardness left his face. I can't just let him keep trying to kill you. I know. But there has to be a better solution than more violence, Wilhelmina thought frantically. What if we could prove the mine was legitimate, or prove that my father paid him back? Can you prove either of those things? No, I don't have any of my father's papers. Everything was lost when he died. She released his arm and began pacing. But there must be something, some way to discredit Webb or turn the town against him. Everett watched her pace, his expression thoughtful. Tell me everything you know about this mine, where it was, when your father sold the shares, anything you can remember. Wilhelmina forced herself to think back, sorting through memories of her father's endless schemes. It was called the Silver Bell, north of Trinidad, up in the mountains. Father said it was a sure thing, that the assay reports showed high-grade ore. She paused, a memory surfacing. He had the assay reports. I saw them on his desk once, all official-looking with stamps and signatures. Where are they now? I don't know. Probably thrown out after he died. The boarding house owner cleared out his room and sold everything to pay the back rent. Who was the assayer? Wilhelmina closed her eyes, trying to remember. Patterson, James Patterson. He had an office near the railroad depot. Everett nodded slowly. If we could find those original assay reports, prove they showed valuable ore, that would suggest your father wasn't cheating Webb. The mine might have just played out, which isn't fraud. But how do we get the reports? We asked Patterson if he kept copies. Most assayers do for legal protection. Everett moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames. And while we're at it, we find out if the Silver Bell was actually worthless or if Webb is lying about being cheated. Hope flickered in Wilhelmina's chest. You think this could work? Maybe. It's better than killing Webb and hoping that solves the problem. He turned to face her. But it means going back to Trinidad, both of us, and that puts you at risk. I'm already at risk. At least this way we're trying to solve the problem instead of just hiding from it. Wilhelmina squared her shoulders, drawing on the courage Everett had told her she possessed. When do we leave? Tomorrow morning. We'll go early before the town is fully awake, and we'll be careful. He crossed to her and put his hands on her shoulders. But Wilhelmina, you have to understand. If this doesn't work, if we can't prove your father's innocence, I will deal with Carson Webb my way. I won't let him keep hunting you. She looked up into his storm-gray eyes and saw the absolute certainty there. Everett Thomas would kill to protect her if necessary, would stain his hands with blood to keep her safe, and the knowledge should have frightened her. Instead, it made her feel cherished. I understand, she said softly. His hands tightened on her shoulders, then released. We should eat and get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. They prepared dinner together, moving around the small cabin with surprising ease. Wilhelmina found herself anticipating Everett's movements, reaching for things before he asked, and he did the same for her. It was domestic and comfortable, and it made her heart ache with longing for something she'd never dared to hope for. A home, a partner, someone to share the quiet moments with. After dinner they sat by the fire, Everett whittling another bird while Wilhelmina mended a tear in her dress. The silence between them was peaceful, full of a companionship that didn't need words. Outside, the stars were coming out, brilliant against the black sky, and the canyon walls rose dark and protective around the cabin. Everett, Wilhelmina set aside her mending. Can I ask you something personal? Yes? Have you ever been in love? His hand stilled on the wood, the knife pausing mid-cut. Once, Long time ago, before the war. Girl I grew up with, planned to marry her when I got back. He resumed whittling, but his movements were more careful. But I came back different. Too different. She couldn't understand what I'd seen, what I'd done, couldn't accept the parts of me that the war had changed. I'm sorry. Don't be. She deserved someone who could give her a normal life. I couldn't be that man anymore. He looked at Wilhelmina, and in his eyes she saw old pain, long since scarred over but never fully healed. What about you? No. I thought I was in love once, when I was 18. A young man who worked in my father's office, but he was only interested in getting closer to my father's business, not to me. She smiled sadly. When we left St. Louis, he didn't even say goodbye. His loss. The simple statement, delivered with complete conviction, made warmth spread through Wilhelmina's chest. You barely know me. I know enough. Everett set aside his whittling and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. I know you're brave and loyal. I know you tried to save your father even when he didn't deserve saving. I know you face your fears instead of running from them. He paused. And I know that every moment I spend with you, I want more moments. That should probably scare me, but it doesn't. Wilhelmina's heart was hammering so hard, she was sure he must be able to hear it. It doesn't scare you, even though we just met? I've learned to trust my instincts. In the war, men who didn't trust their gut feelings didn't survive, and my instincts are telling me that you're someone worth knowing. He held her gaze, unflinching. Worth protecting, worth keeping. Keeping. The word came out breathless. If you'll allow it, if you think you could be happy here, in this isolated canyon with a man who doesn't fit in civilized society. He gestured at the cabin, at himself. I know it's not what you're used to. It's rough and lonely and far from everything. But it's honest. And I can promise you'll always be safe, always be valued, always be seen for who you are. Wilhelmina stood, her legs shaking, and crossed to where he sat. She knelt in front of him, bringing their eyes level, and reached for his hands. They were warm and calloused, strong enough to break but gentle when they touched her. Everett Thomas, I have never felt safer or more valued than I do in this cabin with you. I've never felt more seen. She squeezed his hands. And yes, it scares me because it's so fast and so intense, but I've spent my whole life being scared and careful, and it got me nowhere. So maybe it's time to trust my instincts too. And what are they telling you? That you're someone worth knowing too, worth trusting. She took a shaky breath. Worth loving, maybe, if you'll give me time to figure out if this is real. Everett's eyes darkened, and he pulled her closer until she was settled between his knees. We have time. All the time you need. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. But Wilhelmina, understand something. When I decide to keep someone, I don't let go easy. If you give me your heart, I'll guard it like treasure. I'll protect it with everything I am. And if I break yours, then I'll have known what it was to have it whole for a while. And that's more than most men get. The raw honesty in his words made tears prick Wilhelmina's eyes. She leaned into his touch, turning her face to press a kiss to his palm. His breath caught, and she felt the tremor that ran through him at the simple gesture. Will you hold me again tonight? She asked softly. Not because I'm scared, but because I want to fall asleep in your arms. In answer, Everett stood and drew her to her feet, then led her to the bed. They lay down together, fully clothed, and he arranged the furs over them both before pulling her close against his chest. Wilhelmina settled into the cradle of his arms, her head on his shoulder, and felt him press a kiss to her hair. Sleep, he murmured. Tomorrow we face Trinidad together. But tonight we're here, safe and warm, and that's enough. Wilhelmina closed her eyes and let the steady beat of his heart lull her toward sleep. And just before she drifted off, she realized something that should have terrified her, but instead filled her with quiet joy. She was falling in love with Everett Thomas, and from the way he held her, careful and tender and utterly protective, she thought he might be falling in love with her too. They rode into Trinidad just after dawn, when the streets were empty and the saloons were quiet. Everett had insisted Wilhelmina wear his spare coat and hat, tucking her hair up out of sight, so from a distance she might be mistaken for a young man. It chafed to hide, but she understood the wisdom of it. The assayer's office was locked when they arrived, but Everett had expected that. He produced a set of picks from his saddlebag and made short work of the door, gesturing for Wilhelmina to follow him inside. "Is this legal?" she whispered. "No, but neither is putting a price on your head." He struck a match and lit a lamp, casting warm light across the cramped office. "Start looking for anything with your father's name on it. I'll check the file cabinets." They worked quickly and quietly, sorting through stacks of papers and folders. Wilhelmina's hands shook as she searched, expecting any moment to hear someone discover them. But the office remained quiet, and gradually she found a rhythm. It was Everett who found them. "Here," he said, pulling a folder from the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet. "Silver Bell Mine, assay reports from June 1875. Wilhelmina hurried over and they examined the documents together by lamplight. The reports were detailed and official, complete with stamps and signatures, and they clearly showed high concentrations of silver ore in the samples tested. "These are legitimate," Wilhelmina breathed. "My father wasn't lying about the mine's value." "Not at the time he sold the shares, anyway." Everett tucked the folder inside his coat. "But that doesn't prove it didn't play out later. We need to see the mine itself." "That's a day's ride at least." "Then we'd better get started." He extinguished the lamp and led her back outside, carefully relocking the door behind them. "We'll pick up supplies and head out before the town wakes up properly." They were mounting their horses when a voice called out from behind them. "Well, well, if it isn't Miss Jordan, back from the dead." Wilhelmina's blood ran cold. She turned to see Carson Webb standing in the middle of the street, flanked by two rough-looking men with pistols on their hips. Webb himself was unarmed but smiling, a cruel expression that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Mr. Webb," Wilhelmina said, proud that her voice didn't shake, "you're a hard woman to kill, I'll give you that." Webb's gaze shifted to Everett. "And you must be the mountain man who's been protecting her. Brave, but foolish. There's no profit in defending a cheat's daughter." "Her father wasn't a cheat," Everett said calmly. "We have the assay reports proving the Silver Bell had valuable ore." Webb's smile widened. "Had being the operative word. That mine was salted, you fool. The samples Patterson tested were brought from somewhere else. When my men actually dug into the claim, there was nothing but worthless rock." "You're lying." "Am I? Why don't you ride up there and check for yourself?" "Oh wait, you can't, because I had the mine sealed after it cost me $20,000. Webb gestured to his hired men. "Now, I'm going to give you one chance to walk away from this. Leave the girl with me and you can ride out of Trinidad with your life." Everett's hand moved to his rifle. "Not happening." "Then you'll die with her." The hired guns went for their pistols, but Everett was faster. He fired from the saddle, his shot taking one man in the shoulder and spinning him around. The second man got a shot off that whistled past Wilhelmina's head before Everett's second bullet caught him in the leg and dropped him. Then, Sheriff Dawes was running out of his office, pistol drawn, shouting for everyone to stop. Webb raised his hands innocently, the picture of a law-abiding citizen. "Sheriff, thank God you're here. This man just shot my employees without provocation." "That's not true," Wilhelmina said hotly. "They drew first." "I saw the whole thing from my window," a new voice said. Wilhelmina turned to see the shopkeeper from 2 days ago standing in his doorway. Webb's men went for their guns first. The mountain man was defending himself and the lady. "Is this true?" Dawes looked between Webb and Everett, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. "Ask yourself who's more likely to lie, Sheriff," Everett said coldly. "The woman who's been hiding for her life, or the man who put a price on her head?" Dawes's face reddened. "I don't know anything about a price." "Everyone in Trinidad knows," the shopkeeper said. $500 for proof of her death. Webb's been bragging about it in the saloon." More people were emerging now, drawn by the gunfire, and Wilhelmina saw several heads nodding in agreement. Webb's expression turned ugly. "Fine. Yes, I want her dead. She owes me $20,000, and I mean to collect it one way or another." "She doesn't owe you anything," Everett said. "Her father sold you legitimate shares based on genuine assay reports. If the mine played out, that's the risk of mining, not fraud." "The mine was salted." "Then prove it. Open it up and let an independent assayer examine it." Everett's voice carried across the gathering crowd. "If you're telling the truth, you have nothing to hide." Webb hesitated, and in that hesitation, Wilhelmina saw the truth. "You're lying," she said wonderingly. "The mine wasn't salted. There really was silver there." "Then where is it?" Webb demanded. "Where's my $20,000 worth of ore?" "Maybe you hired the wrong men to run the operation. Maybe they stole it and told you the mine was worthless." Wilhelmina looked at the crowd, at the faces of people who'd known her father, who'd watched him die in the street. "My father was many things, but he wasn't a thief. He sold you shares in a genuine mine. What happened after that isn't my responsibility." The crowd was murmuring now, and Webb could clearly see public opinion turning against him. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Yes, it is." Sheriff Dawes finally found his spine. "Unless you have actual proof that Miss Jordan owes you money, I suggest you drop this matter, and I'd better not hear about any more bounties on her head, or I'll arrest you for solicitation of murder. You don't have the authority." "Try me." Dawes squared his shoulders. "I may not be the bravest lawman in Colorado, but I know right from wrong. And this vendetta of yours is wrong." Webb glared at him, then at Wilhelmina and Everett, then at the crowd that was now openly hostile. Without another word, he turned and stalked away, his wounded hired men limping after him. Wilhelmina felt her knees go weak with relief. It was over. Carson Webb might still hate her, but he couldn't openly try to kill her anymore, not with the sheriff and half the town watching. Everett dismounted and came to her side, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. "You did well," he said quietly. "We did well." She looked up at him, this big, strong man who'd ridden into gunfire for her, who'd stood beside her against her enemies, who'd believed in her father's innocence when no one else would. "Thank you." "Always." He helped her down from her horse, his hands gentle. "Now let's get out of this town before Webb decides to try something else." They rode out of Trinidad at a steady pace, not hurrying but not lingering either. The mountains rose around them, familiar now after 2 days, and Wilhelmina felt the tension drain from her shoulders as they left the town behind. "Where are we going?" she asked when they reached the fork in the trail. "Back to the cabin, unless you'd rather go somewhere else?" Wilhelmina thought about that. She could go anywhere now. She had a small amount of money saved, enough to take a stage to Denver or Santa Fe, to start over somewhere new where no one knew her father's name. But when she tried to imagine leaving, tried to picture a life without Everett Thomas in it, her chest ached with loss. "I'd like to go back to the cabin," she said, "if the offer to stay is still open." Everett's storm-gray eyes met hers, and the warmth in them made her breath catch. "The offer is more than open. It's a hope I've been holding since the moment I saw you." "A hope for what?" "That you might choose to stay. Not because you're hiding or afraid, but because you want to." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. "That you might choose me, and this life, and let me spend every day showing you how precious you are." Wilhelmina's heart swelled so large she thought it might burst. "I choose you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I choose this life, and these mountains, and waking up beside you. I choose all of it, Everett." He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. "Then let's go home." They rode back to the canyon as the sun climbed higher, turning the aspen leaves to gold and the sky to brilliant blue. And when they finally emerged into the hidden valley, when Wilhelmina saw the log cabin nestled against the canyon wall with smoke curling from its chimney, she felt something settle deep in her soul. Home. This was home now. Everett helped her down from her horse, and for a moment they just stood there, hands clasped, looking at each other. Then he pulled her close and wrapped his arms around her, holding her against his broad chest, and Wilhelmina felt safe and wanted and loved in a way she'd never experienced before. "I'm going to court you properly," Everett said into her hair. "Going to take my time and do this right. You've been through enough chaos and violence. You deserve gentle." "I don't need gentle." Wilhelmina pulled back enough to look up at him. "I just need honest. I need real. I need you to be yourself and let me be myself, and we'll figure out the rest together." He cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "Wilhelmina Jordan, I am going to love you for the rest of my life. That's the most honest thing I know. And I'm going to love you right back, Everett Thomas, for the rest of my life, and maybe beyond." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, and Wilhelmina felt the last walls around her heart crumble. This was what she'd been waiting for. Not rescue, not protection, but partnership. A man who saw her strength and valued it, who offered his own strength in return without trying to diminish hers. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Everett rested his forehead against hers. "Stay with me," he whispered. "Build a life here with me. Let me wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you in my arms every night." "Yes," Wilhelmina said. "Yes to all of it." They spent the rest of the day settling in, and it felt different now that Wilhelmina had made her choice. She wasn't a guest anymore, wasn't temporary. She was home, and every action reflected that. She rearranged the cabin to make space for her things, hung her dress beside Everett's shirts, set her few possessions on a shelf he cleared for her. And Everett watched her with such open joy on his face that Wilhelmina found herself smiling constantly, unable to contain her happiness. That night they made dinner together again, but this time they moved as partners, as two people building something together rather than two strangers sharing space. They ate at the table with their knees touching, and afterward they sat by the fire with Wilhelmina tucked against Everett's side, her head on his shoulder. "Tell me about the future," she said, "about what our life will look like." Everett was quiet for a moment, his hand moving slowly through her hair. "In the winter we'll stay close to the cabin. I'll trap and hunt. You can read or sew or whatever pleases you. When the snows get deep, we'll be snowed in for weeks at a time, just the two of us and the fire and the quiet." "That sounds perfect." "In spring, we'll watch the valley come alive. I'll teach you to fish in the creek and we'll ride up to the high meadows to see the wildflowers." His arm tightened around her. "In summer, we'll tend a garden, put up preserves for winter, maybe take a trip to town for supplies, though not often." "And in fall?" "In fall, we'll prepare for the next winter, cut wood, hunt elk, get everything ready." He paused. "And maybe, if you want, we'll start a family." Wilhelmina's breath caught. She'd never let herself think about children, had never believed she'd find a man she'd want to build that kind of future with. But now, sitting in Everett's arms in this peaceful canyon, she could picture it. A child with his storm-gray eyes running through the meadow, another with her dark hair learning to fish in the creek. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I'd like that very much. Then we'll make it happen, but first—" He shifted, tilting her face up to his. "First, I want to marry you, want to stand before God and witnesses and promise to be yours for the rest of my days. We're 2 days' ride from the nearest town with a minister. Then we'll make the ride, or we'll have the minister come here." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the tip of her nose. "I don't care how we do it, as long as it's done proper. As long as everyone knows you're mine and I'm yours." Wilhelmina laughed, giddy with joy. "We've known each other less than a week. I've known you my whole life. I just hadn't met you yet." He gathered her closer until she was practically in his lap. "But if you want to wait, if you need more time to be sure, I'll wait as long as you need." She thought about that, about the conventional wisdom that said she should be cautious, should take months or years to really know him before committing to marriage. But that was the wisdom of the world she'd left behind, the world of calculation and advantage and careful social maneuvering. This was different. This was two souls recognizing each other, two people who fit together like pieces of a puzzle they hadn't known was incomplete. "I don't want to wait," Wilhelmina said. "I want to marry you as soon as we can arrange it. I want to be your wife and build this life with you and never look back at the loneliness I left behind." Everett's answering smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. He stood, lifting her with him, and spun her around in a circle that made her laugh breathlessly. When he set her down, he kissed her again, deeper this time, and Wilhelmina felt heat kindle in her belly. "We should wait for the wedding night," Everett said roughly, pulling back. "You deserve that respect." "I deserve to choose what I want," Wilhelmina countered, "and I want you, all of you, now and forever." "Wilhelmina, I'm 22 years old, Everett. I've spent my entire life doing what's proper and expected, and where did it get me? Hiding behind a water trough while men tried to kill me." She cupped his face in her hands. "I don't want proper anymore. I want real. I want honest. I want you." He searched her eyes, looking for doubt, for hesitation, but Wilhelmina knew he'd find none. She'd never been more certain of anything in her life. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "I've never been more sure of anything." Everett lifted her in his arms, cradling her against his chest, and carried her to the bed. He laid her down gently on the furs and stretched out beside her, propping himself on one elbow so he could look down at her face. "I love you," he said. "I know it's fast and probably crazy, but I love you with everything I am." "I love you too." Wilhelmina reached up and traced the hard line of his jaw, the arch of his cheekbone. "I think I started falling in love with you the moment you wrapped your arms around me on that horse, when you made me feel safe for the first time in my life." He turned his head and kissed her palm, then her wrist, then the inside of her elbow. Slow, reverent kisses that made her shiver with anticipation. And as the fire crackled and the stars came out over the canyon, Everett Thomas showed Wilhelmina Jordan exactly how cherished she was. He was gentle and patient, taking his time, making sure she felt nothing but pleasure. And when they finally came together, when they became one in the most intimate way possible, Wilhelmina felt complete for the first time in her life. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the furs, Everett's arms wrapped around her, her head on his chest. His heartbeat was steady beneath her ear, and his hand moved slowly up and down her back in a soothing rhythm. "No regrets?" he murmured into her hair. "Not a single one." Wilhelmina pressed a kiss to his chest. "You? My only regret is that I didn't find you sooner, that I wasted years up here alone when I could have been loving you. We found each other when we were supposed to, when we were both ready." She tilted her head back to look at him. "Everything that happened before, all the pain and loneliness, it led us here, to this moment, to each other." Everett kissed her forehead, her eyelids, her lips. "Then I'm grateful for every lonely day, every hard moment, because it brought me to you." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and Wilhelmina's last thought before sleep claimed her was that she'd finally found where she belonged. The next weeks passed in a blur of happiness. Everett took Wilhelmina to a small settlement 2 days' ride north, where a traveling preacher happened to be passing through, and they were married in a simple ceremony with the local homesteaders as witnesses. Wilhelmina wore a dress she'd sewn from fabric Everett bought at the general store, pale blue calico that made her eyes bright, and Everett wore clean buckskins and a shirt he'd saved for special occasions. They exchanged vows in the afternoon sunshine, promising to love and cherish each other for the rest of their lives, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Everett kissed her so thoroughly that the witnesses laughed and applauded. "Mrs. Thomas," he said against her lips, and Wilhelmina felt joy bubble up inside her. "Mr. Thomas," she replied, and kissed him again. They stayed that night at the settlement, in a small room above the general store that served as lodging for travelers, and Everett made love to his wife properly, taking his time, showing her with his body what words couldn't express. The ride back to the canyon felt different. They were husband and wife now, bound together in the eyes of God and the law, and every moment felt precious. They stopped frequently, sometimes to rest the horses, but more often just to kiss, to hold each other, to marvel at the fact that they'd found each other in this vast, wild territory. When they finally rode into their hidden valley, Wilhelmina looked at the cabin with new eyes. This was her home now, truly and completely. The place where she would raise children, grow old, build a life with the man she loved. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thomas," Everett said, helping her down from her horse. "It feels more like home every day," Wilhelmina replied, and meant it. They settled into married life with surprising ease. Wilhelmina had worried that living in such close quarters might be difficult, that they might clash or drive each other mad. But instead they found a rhythm that worked, dividing tasks and working together, learning each other's habits and preferences. Everett taught her to hunt and fish, to read the weather and the signs of wildlife. Wilhelmina taught him to read and write better, spending evenings by the fire helping him practice his letters. They worked together to expand the garden plot, planning what they'd plant come spring. And at night they came together with passion and tenderness, learning each other's bodies, discovering what brought pleasure and what brought joy. Winter came early that year, with the first snow falling in early November. Everett had been right about being snowed in. For weeks at a time the canyon entrance was impassable, blocked by drifts taller than a man. But Wilhelmina didn't mind. She had everything she needed right here. Firewood and food, furs to keep them warm, and Everett's strong arms around her every night. They spent the long winter evenings talking, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes for the future. Everett told her about the war, about the things he'd seen and done that still haunted him. Wilhelmina shared memories of her mother, the good years before she died, and even some fond memories of her father before greed consumed him. "Do you miss Trinidad?" Everett asked one night as they lay in bed, the wind howling outside. Wilhelmina considered. "I miss having other people around sometimes, having someone to talk to besides you." "That's fair." He didn't sound offended. "But not enough to go back," she continued. "This life, with you, is worth more than all the society and conversation in the world." She turned in his arms to face him. "Do you ever wish you'd chosen differently, that you'd found someone who could give you children and a normal life?" "You can give me children. The doctor said there's no reason you can't." Everett brushed hair back from her face. "And I don't want a normal life. I want this life, with you, in this canyon where we can be ourselves. What if I can't have children?" The fear had been growing in her, the worry that she might disappoint him. "Then we'll love each other and be happy anyway." He kissed her forehead. "Children would be a blessing, but you're the one I chose. You're enough, Wilhelmina. You'll always be enough." The tears that slipped down her cheeks were born of relief and love. She kissed him deeply, pouring all her emotion into it, and Everett responded with gentle passion. Spring came eventually, as it always did, melting the snow and filling the creek with rushing water. The wildflowers bloomed exactly as Everett had described, carpeting the meadow in color, and Wilhelmina spent hours walking among them, marveling at their beauty. And one morning, in late April, she woke with an unfamiliar queasiness in her stomach. It took her a week to be certain, but when she was sure, Wilhelmina waited until Everett came in from checking his trap lines. He was washing his hands in the basin by the door when she spoke. "Everett, I need to tell you something." He turned, immediately alert. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She moved closer, taking his hands in hers. "Everything's right. Everything's perfect." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "You're with child?" "Yes." Wilhelmina felt tears of joy prick her eyes. "We're going to have a baby." Everett's whoop of delight echoed off the canyon walls. He picked her up and spun her around, careful despite his excitement, then set her down and knelt in front of her, pressing his face against her still flat stomach. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby." Wilhelmina ran her fingers through his hair, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Are you happy?" "I'm beyond happy. I'm blessed." He looked up at her, his eyes shining with tears. "You've given me everything, Wilhelmina. A home, a purpose, a reason to be better. And now a child." "We gave each other everything," she corrected gently. "We built this together." He stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully, and Wilhelmina felt the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. This man, this beautiful, strong, gentle man, was hers, and she was his. And together they were creating new life, a child who would grow up surrounded by love and mountains and the kind of peace that came from living honestly. The pregnancy was easy, blessed by good health and Everett's devoted care. He fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest more, making sure she ate well, worrying about everything from her comfort to the position of the baby. Wilhelmina found his concern endearing even when it became a bit much. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she said one day when he tried to stop her from carrying water from the creek. "I know, but you're carrying my child, and I want to make sure you're both safe." "We're safe. We're healthy. And I need to stay active or I'll go mad." Everett relented, but he still hovered, and Wilhelmina loved him for it. As her belly grew, they began preparing for the baby's arrival. Everett built a cradle from pine, carving animals into the sides with the same skill he brought to his whittling. Wilhelmina sewed tiny clothes from fabric they'd bought on a trip to the settlement, making gowns and blankets and caps. And they talked about names, debating options by the fire each night. "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him after my father," Everett said one evening. "What was his name?" "James. James Everett Thomas." He looked at her hopefully. "What do you think?" "I think it's perfect. And if it's a girl?" Wilhelmina thought about that. She didn't want to name a daughter after her mother, those memories still too painful, but there was another name, one that had meaning for both of them. "Grace," she said, "for the grace that brought us together." Everett smiled and took her hand. "Grace Thomas. I like it." The baby came on a cold October morning, almost exactly a year after the day Everett had saved Wilhelmina's life in Trinidad. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Everett looked terrified, when Wilhelmina saw the fear in his eyes that he might lose her. But she was strong, stronger than either of them had realized, and when the baby finally arrived with a lusty cry, Wilhelmina felt a surge of triumph along with the overwhelming love. "It's a boy," Everett said, his voice choked with emotion. "We have a son." He placed the tiny bundle in her arms, and Wilhelmina looked down at the red-faced, squalling infant with wonder. He had dark hair like hers and what looked like Everett's eyes, storm gray and serious even at just moments old. "Hello, James," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." Everett knelt beside the bed, one arm around Wilhelmina's shoulders, the other hand gently touching his son's tiny fist. "He's perfect." "He is." Wilhelmina leaned against her husband, exhausted, but happy. "We made him together, you and I, out of love and hope and everything good. The first of many, I hope. Let me recover from this one first," Wilhelmina said with a tired laugh. "Then we can talk about more." They spent the rest of that day as a new family, learning how to care for their son, marveling at his tiny fingers and toes. Everett was surprisingly good with the baby, handling him with the same gentle strength he brought to everything. And watching her husband cradle their son, singing softly to him in his deep voice, Wilhelmina fell even more deeply in love. The years that followed were full and rich. James grew into a sturdy boy with his father's quiet strength and his mother's quick mind. 2 years later, they had a daughter, Grace, who had Wilhelmina's dark eyes and Everett's determination. And 2 years after that, another son, Samuel, who was sweet-natured and curious about everything. The cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family. Everett built an addition with 2 more rooms, giving the children space while still keeping them close. The garden grew larger, producing more food for more mouths. The canyon that had once been so quiet and isolated filled with the sounds of childhood. Laughter and squeals, questions and discoveries, the constant motion of children exploring their world. Wilhelmina had never been happier. She woke each morning to Everett's kiss and the sound of their children playing. She spent her days teaching them to read and write, to appreciate the beauty of the mountains, to be kind and honest and brave. And she fell asleep each night in her husband's arms, safe and loved and utterly content. Trinidad seemed like another life, something that had happened to a different person. The scared woman who'd hidden behind a water trough while men tried to kill her was gone, replaced by someone stronger. A mother, a wife, a woman who knew her own worth. They did occasionally make trips to the settlement for supplies and news, and word filtered back that Carson Webb had left Colorado after a business deal went sour. The sheriff who'd finally stood up for justice had been re-elected several times. Trinidad was growing and changing, becoming more civilized as the railroad brought more people west. But none of that touched the Thomas family in their hidden canyon. They lived apart from the world, creating their own small paradise in the mountains. One evening when Wilhelmina was 30 years old, she and Everett sat on the porch they'd built onto the cabin, watching the sunset over the canyon walls. The children were inside, supposedly getting ready for bed, but more likely playing. From inside came muffled giggles and the sound of small feet running. "I should go check on them," Wilhelmina said, but made no move to stand. "Let them play a bit longer." Everett pulled her closer, his arm around her shoulders. "We don't get much quiet time anymore. I wouldn't trade it for anything." "Neither would I." He kissed the top of her head. "Do you ever regret choosing this life? Choosing me?" Wilhelmina twisted to look at him in surprise. "Never. Why would you ask that?" "Sometimes I wonder if you wouldn't be happier with more company, more society. You gave up a lot to be here with me." "I gave up nothing that mattered and gained everything that does." She cupped his face in her hand, this beloved face that had grown even dearer with the years. "Everett Thomas, you are my home, you and our children and this canyon. I have never regretted one single moment of choosing you. Even when I'm impossible and overprotective. Especially then, because it means you love me." She kissed him softly. I love you more now than I did the day we married, and I'll love you even more tomorrow. That's how this works." He pulled her into his lap, and they sat like that as the stars came out, holding each other the way they had that first night in the cabin. So much had changed since then. They were older, more weathered by time and life. They had responsibilities and worries they'd never imagined, but the core of it, the love between them, had only grown stronger. "Mama! Papa!" Grace came running out onto the porch. "James says I can't go fishing tomorrow, but I want to go." "You can go fishing if you finish your chores first," Everett said calmly, "but that's not fair. Life rarely is, sweetheart, but it's the rule." Grace huffed but accepted the judgment, running back inside to argue with her brother about something else. Wilhelmina and Everett shared an amused glance. "They're going to drive us mad," Wilhelmina said. "Probably. But they're our children, so they come by it honestly." They sat a while longer, savoring the peace, before finally going inside to wrangle their offspring into bed. The cabin was full and warm and alive, exactly the opposite of the cold, lonely places both Wilhelmina and Everett had known before they found each other. After the children were finally settled and the cabin was quiet, they lay in their own bed, wrapped in each other's arms. It was their ritual, this time together at the end of each day, and neither would have given it up for anything. "Do you remember that first night?" Wilhelmina asked quietly. "When I had the nightmare and you held me. I remember thinking I never wanted to let you go." "You haven't. In all these years, you've never let me go." She pressed closer to him. "And I've never let you go either. Never will." Everett's arms tightened around her. "You're mine, Wilhelmina Thomas, for the rest of our lives and whatever comes after. And you're mine, Everett Thomas, my mountain man, my protector, my love." They fell asleep like that, as they had every night for the past 8 years. Wrapped in each other's arms, safe and warm and utterly at peace. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges. The children grew older, developing their own personalities and dreams. James became serious and thoughtful, like his father, spending hours in the woods learning to track and hunt. Grace was fiery and independent, insisting she could do anything her brothers could do and usually proving it. Samuel remained sweet and gentle, preferring to read and draw rather than hunt, and Everett and Wilhelmina loved him no less for it. When James turned 16, he began talking about seeing more of the world. It frightened Wilhelmina, the thought of her eldest child leaving the safety of the canyon, but Everett was calmer. "He needs to find his own path," he said one night after James had gone to bed. "We can't keep him here forever, any more than we can keep any of them. I know, but I'm not ready." "You'll never be ready. That's part of being a parent." He pulled her close. "But we raised him right. He's strong and smart and good. He'll be fine." And he was. James left for a year, working at a ranch in southern Colorado, learning about cattle and horses and a different kind of life. But he came back, declaring that nothing compared to the mountains, and Wilhelmina felt a mother's relief. Grace left too when she was 18, but only as far as the settlement. She wanted to be a teacher, and she apprenticed herself to the schoolmaster there, learning how to educate children. She visited often, bringing news and supplies, and eventually a young man named Daniel, who looked at her like she hung the moon. Samuel never wanted to leave at all. He was content in the canyon, helping his father with the trapping and hunting, spending his free time sketching the wildlife and landscapes. He was 20 when he finally met someone, a shy girl from the settlement who shared his love of quiet and art, and he brought her home to meet his parents with obvious nervousness. Wilhelmina loved her instantly. The years brought grandchildren, a whole new generation to fill the canyon with noise and laughter. James married a practical woman named Sarah, who took to mountain life with enthusiasm, and they had 4 children in quick succession. Grace and Daniel had 3, splitting their time between the settlement and the canyon. Samuel and his wife Emma had 2 quiet, artistic children who adored their grandfather. And through it all, Everett and Wilhelmina remained the center, the anchor around which the family revolved. They were in their 50s now, with silver threading through their hair and lines etched on their faces. But they were still strong, still vital, still deeply in love. Did you ever imagine this? Wilhelmina asked one summer day as they watched their grandchildren play in the meadow. That we'd have all of this? No. Everett took her hand, lacing their fingers together. That day I rode into Trinidad and saw you hiding behind that water trough. I was just trying to help someone in trouble. I never imagined it would lead to this, to you, to our children, to all of this love. No man had ever wrapped his arms around me before you, Wilhelmina said softly. No one had ever made me feel safe and precious and seen. And then you came along and changed everything. You changed everything for me too. I was just existing before you, going through the motions. You gave me a reason to live instead of just survive. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the children play, their hands clasped tight. They'd lived through so much together. Harsh winters and difficult births, lean years and years of plenty, the trials of raising children and the joys of watching them grow. Through it all, they'd held tight to each other, their love the foundation on which everything else was built. That night, after the family had eaten together and the children and grandchildren had departed to their own homes, scattered around the canyon and settlement, Everett and Wilhelmina sat by the fire in the cabin that had been their home for over 30 years. "I'm tired," Wilhelmina admitted, resting her head on Everett's shoulder. "Good tired or bad tired?" "Good tired, fulfilled tired," she smiled. "The kind of tired that comes from a life well lived. We have lived it well, haven't we?" Everett's arm came around her shoulders. "Built something real and lasting." "We did." Wilhelmina thought about the scared 22-year-old who'd arrived in this canyon so long ago. "I wish I could go back and tell that frightened girl that everything was going to be all right, that she was going to find love and family and a home that would last forever." She found it because she was brave enough to trust, brave enough to choose love when it would have been easier to stay guarded. Everett kissed her temple. "You were always brave, Wilhelmina. I just helped you see it. We helped each other see a lot of things." She turned in his arms to look at him. His face was weathered now, lined with age, but his storm-gray eyes were as clear and honest as ever. "I love you, Everett Thomas, just as much today as I did 30 years ago, more even. I love you too, Wilhelmina Thomas, more than words can say." They kissed, a gentle press of lips that held 30 years of love and partnership. And when they went to bed that night, they held each other the same way they had that very first night, arms wrapped tight, hearts beating in sync, safe and warm and utterly content. The mountain man who had ridden into Trinidad all those years ago had been looking for supplies, nothing more. But he'd found a woman in trouble and stopped to help, and that single choice had led to everything. To love and family, to purpose and joy, to a life richer than anything he'd imagined. And the woman who'd hidden behind a water trough, certain she was about to die, had been saved by a stranger. But he'd become so much more than a savior. He'd become her partner, her love, her home. They'd built a life together in that hidden canyon, raised a family, created a legacy that would extend through their children and grandchildren for generations to come. And it all started because Everett Thomas had wrapped his arms around Wilhelmina Jordan and held her safe. No man had ever held her like that before. And afterward, no man ever needed to again, because Everett Thomas held her every night until dawn for the rest of their long and happy lives together. Their story became a legend in the family, passed down through the generations. The tale of how great-grandmother Wilhelmina had been saved by great-grandfather Everett, how they'd fallen in love in just days and built a dynasty in the mountains. The children and grandchildren would ask to hear it again and again, and Wilhelmina and Everett would share the story, holding hands as they recounted their beginning. As the years advanced and they moved into their 60s, their pace slowed, but their love never did. They could no longer ride as far or work as hard, but they could still walk through the meadow together, still sit on their porch watching the sunset, still fall asleep in each other's arms every single night. When Everett's health began to fail at age 72, Wilhelmina nursed him with the same devotion he'd shown her throughout their marriage. She sat beside his bed, holding his hand, telling him stories of their life together. And when the end came, peaceful and gentle, Wilhelmina was there beside him. "I love you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'll love you forever." "And I love you," Everett managed, his voice weak but his eyes still clear. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for this beautiful life. Thank you for saving me, for seeing me, for loving me." He smiled, that same gentle smile that had always made her heart skip. "Best decision I ever made." And with Wilhelmina's hand in his, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, Everett Thomas closed his eyes for the last time. Wilhelmina lived another 5 years after that, surrounded by family but never quite whole without her husband. She spoke of him often, keeping his memory alive, and every night she would look at the empty space beside her in bed and remember all the nights he had held her safe. When her own time came, at age 73, she went peacefully in her sleep. Her children found her the next morning looking serene, a slight smile on her face, and they knew she'd gone to join Everett at last. They buried her beside him in the meadow they'd both loved, under the aspen trees that turned gold each fall. And the family they'd created continued on, generation after generation, living in the canyon and surrounding areas, carrying forward the legacy of love and courage that Everett and Wilhelmina had built. The story of the mountain man and the woman he saved became part of the family mythology, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. But those who'd known Everett and Wilhelmina personally never forgot the truth beneath the tale. That these had been real people who'd found real love in the most unlikely circumstances, who'd chosen each other and built something lasting and true. The cabin still stands, maintained by the family as a memorial to their ancestors. Visitors can see the bed where Wilhelmina and Everett slept, the fireplace where they sat together on cold nights, the cradle Everett carved for their first child. And if you sit quietly in that cabin at twilight, when the light is soft and golden, you can almost feel their presence still. The mountain man and his beloved wife, forever entwined, forever home. Because some loves are strong enough to transcend even death, some bonds are forged so deep that they echo through eternity. And the love between Everett Thomas and Wilhelmina Jordan was exactly that kind of love. It started with a man wrapping his arms around a frightened woman, offering safety and protection. It grew into partnership and passion, into family and legacy. And it endured beyond their mortal lives, living on in the hearts and memories of everyone who came after. No man had ever wrapped his arms around her before Everett Thomas, and he held her, not just until dawn, but through every dawn of their lives together and beyond, into whatever comes after. Their story was complete, their journey finished, their love eternal. And in the hidden canyon where they'd built their life together, where wildflowers still bloom each spring and elk still bugle in the fall, the spirit of that love remains. A testament to what two people can build when they choose each other, trust each other, and hold on tight through all the challenges life brings. Everett and Wilhelmina Thomas lived, loved, and left a legacy that would never be forgotten. And that, in the end, is the best happily ever after anyone could hope for.